Baby saw a bear cub trapped in a construction site pipe. What Baby did next was heroic. The morning mist hung low over the abandoned construction site, creating ghostly shapes that danced between the skeletal frames of unfinished buildings. Michael Hayes adjusted his jacket against the cool air while his wife Lily Morgan pushed their son Jacob's stroller along the rough dirt path that wound through the edge of the site. They had discovered this route just last week, a peaceful shortcut that cut through the chaos of their usually busy neighborhood, offering them moments of quiet before the world woke up completely. Jacob, barely 2 years old, babbled happily in his stroller, his tiny hands reaching out toward everything that caught his attention. A flutter of leaves, a bird taking flight, the way sunlight broke through the mist in golden streams. The construction site had been dormant for months now. Some dispute between contractors leaving it in this strange state of half-completion, and nature had already begun its slow reclamation process. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete foundations, and morning glory vines had started wrapping themselves around the metal beams, creating an oddly beautiful marriage between human ambition and natural persistence. Michael loved these morning walks because they gave him time to think before diving into his demanding job at the architectural firm downtown. He often found himself studying the abandoned structures with a professional eye, imagining what the original plans might have looked like, what dreams had been sketched on blueprints before everything came to a halt. Lily enjoyed them for different reasons. She was a kindergarten teacher who spent her days surrounded by constant noise and activity. So these quiet morning moments felt like meditation to her. She would often stop to examine interesting plants growing along the path, teaching Jacob simple words like flower and green and pretty, though he mostly responded with his own invented language that only he seemed to understand completely. Today felt different somehow, though neither parent could quite put their finger on why. Perhaps it was the unusual stillness in the air, or the way the mist seemed thicker than normal, creating an almost dreamlike quality to their surroundings. As they rounded a bend in the path, Jacob suddenly became very animated in his stroller, pointing insistently toward a cluster of large concrete pipes that had been stacked haphazardly near what would have been the foundation of another building. These pipes, each about 4 feet in diameter, had been there since the construction stopped, gradually becoming part of the landscape. Some had filled with rainwater and become impromptu homes for frogs and insects, while others remained dry, dark tunnels that seemed to lead nowhere. Jacob's pointing became more urgent, and he began making a sound that wasn't quite crying, but held an intensity that made both parents stop walking. "What is it, buddy?" Michael asked, kneeling down beside the stroller to follow his son's gaze. Jacob kept pointing at one particular pipe, the largest one that lay slightly separated from the others, its dark opening facing them like a giant eye. Lily noticed how Jacob's entire body seemed focused on that pipe, his usual scattered toddler attention completely absorbed by this one thing. She had seen him excited about dogs, fascinated by airplanes flying overhead, delighted by puddles after rain. But this was different. This was concentration of a kind she had never witnessed in him before. "Maybe he sees something," she suggested to Michael, though from where they stood, the pipe appeared to contain nothing but shadows. They moved closer, Michael pushing the stroller while Lily walked beside them, both adults now curious about what had captured their son's attention so completely. The ground around the pipes was soft from recent rain, and their footsteps made slight squelching sounds as they approached. Jacob's sounds grew more insistent, not distressed exactly, but urgent in a way that made them continue forward despite the muddy ground. When they were about 10 feet from the pipe, Jacob started trying to climb out of his stroller, something he rarely did during their walks. His little hands fumbled with the safety straps while he continued making those urgent sounds, his eyes never leaving the dark opening of the pipe. Okay, we'll check it out," Michael said, lifting his son from the stroller and holding him securely. As soon as Jacob was free, he reached both arms toward the pipe, his whole body straining in that direction. It was then, in a moment of perfect silence between Jacob's vocalizations, that they heard it. A sound so faint they might have missed it entirely if they hadn't been paying such close attention. It was a whimper, soft and plaintive, coming from somewhere deep within the pipe. Michael and Lily exchanged glances, both recognizing the sound of an animal in distress. Michael set Jacob down carefully, keeping a firm grip on his hand, and moved closer to the pipe's opening. The interior was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out something moving far inside, maybe 15 or 20 feet from the entrance. "There's definitely something in there," he told Lily, who had come up beside him with Jacob. The whimpering came again, slightly louder this time, and it had a quality that tugged at something deep in their parental instincts. It sounded young, vulnerable, scared. Jacob pulled against his father's grip, clearly wanting to go closer, but Michael held him back while trying to get a better look inside the pipe. "Should we call someone?" Lily asked, already pulling out her phone, though she wasn't sure who exactly they should call. Animal control? The police? The fire department? The construction company that owned this site? As she scrolled through her contacts, trying to decide, Michael had grabbed a stick and was gently tapping on the side of the pipe, hoping to either encourage whatever was inside to come out or at least get a better sense of what they were dealing with. The tapping seemed to agitate whatever was trapped, and the whimpering turned into a more desperate crying sound that made all three of them, even little Jacob, freeze in place. It was unmistakably the sound of a baby animal, and it was unmistakably terrified. "We need a flashlight," Michael said, checking his pockets, though he knew he hadn't brought one. "Who brings a flashlight on a morning walk?" Lily checked her phone's flashlight function, but the beam wasn't strong enough to penetrate the darkness of the pipe effectively. They could see maybe 5 feet in, where the morning light gave way to impenetrable shadow. Jacob, meanwhile, had sat down on the ground and was making soft, soothing sounds toward the pipe, the same sounds Lily made when comforting him after a nightmare. It was such a pure, instinctive response that both parents stopped their frantic planning to watch him. He was rocking slightly, the way he did when he was trying to be patient, and his little voice carried into the pipe with a gentleness that seemed to quiet the crying inside. "I'm going to run back to the car," Michael announced, remembering the emergency kit in their trunk that included a proper flashlight. "It's only 5 minutes. Will you be okay here?" Lily nodded, pulling Jacob into her lap as they sat on a relatively dry patch of ground near the pipe's entrance. As Michael jogged away, his footsteps fading into the morning mist, Lily found herself listening intently to the sounds from the pipe. The crying had softened to occasional whimpers, as if whatever was inside had exhausted itself. Jacob continued his soft babbling, occasionally reaching toward the pipe's opening as if offering comfort across the distance. Lily found herself humming quietly, the same lullaby she used to help Jacob sleep, and wondered if sounds of comfort were universal enough to cross species boundaries. The construction site felt even quieter with Michael gone, and Lily became aware of other sounds she hadn't noticed before. The distant hum of early morning traffic, birds beginning their daily songs, the whisper of wind through the partially constructed buildings. But underneath it all was that soft, heartbreaking sound from the pipe, a reminder that something small and frightened was depending on them. Jacob seemed to understand this on some level, his usual toddler energy replaced by an unusual patience and focus. He kept looking between the pipe and his mother's face, as if checking that she understood the importance of what they had found. When he reached for his favorite toy, a well-worn stuffed rabbit that went everywhere with him, and tried to offer it toward the pipe, Lily felt tears prick her eyes at the simple compassion of the gesture. Michael returned faster than expected, breathing hard and carrying not just a flashlight but also a blanket from the car and a bottle of water. "I thought we might need these," he explained, clicking on the flashlight and directing its beam into the pipe. What they saw made all three of them gasp simultaneously. Deep in the pipe, pressed against what appeared to be a partial collapse of earth that had blocked the far end, was a small bear cub. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fur matted with mud, and its eyes reflecting the flashlight beam with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The cub was clearly stuck, unable to back out the way it had come in, and too small and weak to clear the obstruction blocking its path forward. "Oh my God," Lily whispered, instinctively pulling Jacob closer, while simultaneously feeling her heart break for the trapped animal. The cub, seeing them clearly for the first time in the flashlight's beam, let out another pitiful cry that seemed to echo through the pipe and straight into their hearts. Michael was already on his phone, calling 911, though he wasn't sure if this qualified as an emergency in the traditional sense. As he explained the situation to the dispatcher, Lily noticed Jacob trying once again to offer his stuffed rabbit, stretching his little arm as far as it would go toward the pipe's opening. The gesture was so pure, so instinctively kind that she didn't stop him, instead helping him place the toy just inside the entrance of the pipe where the cub could see it. What happened next surprised them all. The cub, seeing the toy, seemed to calm slightly. Its cries softened to what almost sounded like curious snuffles, and it shifted position slightly, as if trying to get a better look at this offering. Jacob clapped his hand softly, the way he did when he was pleased, and made more of his soothing sounds. The dispatcher had told Michael that animal control was on their way, but it might take up to an hour given their location in the early morning hour. An hour felt like an eternity when listening to an animal in distress, but Michael relayed the information to Lily, and they settled in to wait, keeping the flashlight trained on the cub so it wouldn't feel alone in the darkness. As they waited, something strange began to happen. The cub, perhaps encouraged by their presence or simply too exhausted to maintain its fear, began to inch forward slightly. It was slow progress, maybe an inch at a time, but it was movement. Jacob seemed to understand that this was important and increased his encouraging sounds, patting the ground near the pipe's entrance as if showing the cub it was safe to come closer. Lily found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sudden movement or sound might scare the cub back into the depths of the pipe. Michael kept the flashlight steady, providing a beacon for the small animal to follow. The morning sun had risen higher now, burning off some of the mist and warming the air around them, but none of them noticed the changing weather. So focused were they on the drama unfolding in the pipe. 20 minutes passed this way, with the cub making painfully slow progress toward them. It would move forward a few inches, then stop, crying softly, before gathering courage to move again. Jacob never lost patience, continuing his stream of baby talk and encouragement as if he and the cub were having a conversation only they could understand. It was during one of these pauses that Lily noticed movement in her peripheral vision. She turned her head slowly, not wanting to startle anyone, and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. About 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a stack of concrete blocks, was an adult bear. The mother, Lily realized with a mixture of awe and concern. The bear was watching them intently but hadn't made any aggressive moves, seeming to understand somehow that they were trying to help. "Michael," Lily whispered, barely moving her lips, "don't make any sudden movements, but look to your left. behind the concrete blocks. Michael turned his head slowly, following her instructions, and saw the mother bear. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the humans, not the mother bear, not even little Jacob, who seemed to sense the sudden tension in his parents. The bear took a step forward, then stopped, her eyes fixed on the pipe where her cub remained trapped. She made a low sound, not quite a growl, but something that rumbled through the morning air, and the cub in the pipe responded with increased crying. It was clear she had been here for who knows how long, unable to help her baby, watching it grow weaker and more frightened with each passing hour. The situation had suddenly become much more complicated. They were now between a mother bear and her trapped cub, a position that every wildlife safety guide would tell you never to be in. But moving away might mean abandoning the cub just when it was starting to make progress toward freedom. Michael slowly reached for Lily's hand, ready to grab Jacob and retreat if the mother bear showed any signs of aggression. But the bear seemed more interested in the pipe than in them. She took another step forward, then stopped again, her body language speaking of desperation rather than threat. It was as if she understood that these humans were her cub's only chance, and she was willing to tolerate their presence if it meant saving her baby. Jacob, in that way, children sometimes understand things adults overthink, raised his hand and waved at the mother bear. It was the same wave he gave to dogs at the park, to people in the grocery store, to anyone and anything that caught his attention. The bear's head tilted slightly, as if puzzled by this small human gesture, and then she sat down. Just sat down right there behind the concrete blocks, maintaining her distance but clearly indicating she wasn't going anywhere. Lily felt tears running down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the strange trust being displayed. The mother bear's willingness to let them help, despite every instinct that must be screaming at her to charge forward and protect her cub. "We need to work faster," Michael said quietly, understanding that having the mother bear this close added urgency to an already tense situation. He looked at the pipe, calculating distances and angles with his architect's eye. The cub had made it about halfway but seemed to be tiring, its movements becoming slower and less coordinated. If we could somehow make the opening more appealing, less scary, maybe it would come out faster. Lily had an idea. She took the blanket Michael had brought and, moving very slowly so as not to alarm the mother bear, spread it at the entrance of the pipe, creating a softer, more welcoming space. She placed Jacob's stuffed rabbit on the blanket, and then, remembering the water bottle, poured a small amount into her cupped hand and placed it where the cub could see and smell it. The effect was almost immediate. The cub, perhaps sensing the water or encouraged by the softer appearance of the pipe's exit, began moving forward with renewed energy. Its cries changed from desperation to something that sounded almost hopeful, and it covered more ground in the next 5 minutes than it had in the previous 20. Jacob bounced excitedly in his mother's arms, clapping and babbling encouragement, while Michael kept the flashlight steady and watched the mother bear for any signs of movement. She remained where she was, though her body was tense with anticipation, every muscle ready to spring into action once her cub was free. The cub was now close enough that they could see details, its small paws caked with mud, its nose pink and black, its eyes wide with fear but also determination. It was smaller than Lily had expected, probably only 20 pounds, and she wondered how long it had been trapped, how hungry and thirsty it must be. As if reading her thoughts, the cub stretched its neck toward the water she had poured, still just out of reach but close enough to motivate it forward. Another few inches, another pause to gather strength, another push forward. The tension was almost unbearable, everyone willing the small creature to keep going, to make it those last few feet to freedom. It was Jacob who broke the tension in the most unexpected way. He started singing, if you could call his babbling, tuneless sound singing. It was the song Lily sang to him every night, or at least his version of it, and he directed it straight at the cub with the serious concentration of a tiny performer. The cub's ears perked up at this new sound, and it tilted its head in a way that was almost comically similar to its mother's earlier gesture. Then, as if Jacob's song had given it the final boost of courage needed, the cub made a desperate scramble forward, its back paws finding purchase on the pipe's smooth surface, and suddenly it was at the entrance, half in and half out of the pipe, blinking in the morning sunlight. For a moment, nobody moved. The cub stood there, trembling slightly, water dripping from its mouth where it had desperately lapped at Lily's offering, looking between the humans and the direction where its mother waited. Michael slowly backed away, pulling Lily and Jacob with him, creating a clear path between the cub and its mother. The little bear took a tentative step onto the blanket, then another, its legs shaky from the ordeal but functioning. It picked up Jacob's stuffed rabbit in its mouth, perhaps thinking it was food or simply acting on instinct, and that's when the mother bear stood up. She made a soft calling sound, very different from her earlier rumble, and the cub's head snapped in her direction. What followed was one of the most beautiful reunions any of them had ever witnessed. The cub dropped the toy and ran, stumbled really, toward its mother, crying out in a way that sounded like relief and joy mixed together. The mother bear met it halfway, immediately beginning to check it over with her nose, licking its muddy fur, making soft sounds that needed no translation. They were the sounds of a mother reunited with her child, universal in any language, any species. The cub pressed against its mother's side, seeming to shrink into her fur, safe at last after what must have been a terrifying ordeal. For several minutes, the bears simply stayed like that, the mother cleaning and comforting her cub while it nursed, both of them ignoring the human audience to their reunion. Then the mother bear did something extraordinary. She looked directly at Michael, Lily, and Jacob, holding eye contact for several long seconds. It wasn't a threatening look or a fearful one. If Lily had to describe it later, she would say it looked like acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude, though she knew that was probably her human emotions projecting onto a wild animal. The bear then gently nudged her cub, and together they began to walk away, not hurried or frightened, just a mother and child heading home. The cub looked back once, and Jacob waved again, calling out, "Bye-bye," in his clear toddler voice. The cub continued on with its mother, and within minutes they had disappeared into the tree line at the edge of the construction site. The family stood there for a long moment after the bears were gone, processing what had just happened. Jacob was the first to break the silence, pointing at his stuffed rabbit still lying on the blanket and saying, "Bear, take Bunny?" in a questioning tone. Lily laughed, a release of all the tension she had been holding, and hugged him tightly. "No, sweetheart. The bear left Bunny for you, but you were so kind to share." Michael picked up the toy, now slightly damp and definitely muddy, and handed it back to his son, who hugged it tightly as if it had been on a great adventure. They were still standing there, gathering their things and preparing to leave, when animal control arrived, their truck pulling up to the construction site with lights flashing. The officer who emerged looked confused to find just a family with a toddler instead of a trapped bear. Michael explained what had happened, showing him the pipe and describing the cub's escape and reunion with its mother. The officer inspected the pipe, noting the partial collapse at the far end that had created the trap, and said he would make sure it was properly sealed to prevent future incidents. "You folks did a good thing," he told them. "Most people would have just called us and left, but that cub might not have made it another hour in there. Sometimes it takes a gentle touch to coax a scared animal to safety. He ruffled Jacob's hair, who was now contentedly playing with his rabbit, seemingly unaware of his heroic role in the rescue. As they walked back to their car, the morning sun now fully up and warming their faces, Lily found herself thinking about the strange magic of the morning's events. How Jacob had somehow known something was wrong before they had heard any sound. How his innocent, instinctive compassion had helped calm a terrified wild animal. How a mother bear had trusted them enough to let them help, going against every protective instinct. Michael seemed to be thinking similar thoughts, because he said quietly, "Do you think he'll remember this when he's older?" Lily looked at their son, now drowsy in his father's arms, clutching his muddy rabbit and mumbling something about bears. "Maybe not the details," she replied. "But I think somewhere deep down he'll remember that helping others, even when they're different from us, even when it's scary, is just what you do." They decided to take a different route home, leaving the construction site to its morning peace. But as they drove away, Lily looked back once and could have sworn she saw a shape at the tree line. Maybe the mother bear, maybe just shadows and imagination. Either way, she whispered a quiet thank you into the morning air. "Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for letting us help. Thank you for showing us that compassion crosses all boundaries." Jacob had fallen asleep in his car seat, his rabbit held tight, and Lily reached back to brush his hair gently. Her baby, her hero, who had shown them all that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can bridge the widest gaps between worlds. The story of that morning would become family legend, told and retold at gatherings, each time gaining small embellishments but never losing its core truth, that a toddler's pure heart had saved a life. Friends would express disbelief about the mother bear's behavior, but Michael and Lily knew what they had witnessed. They had seen trust born of desperation, understanding born of necessity, and gratitude that needed no words. They had Jacob's muddy rabbit, which Lily couldn't bring herself to wash for weeks, as proof of their adventure. And sometimes, Waku, on their morning walks, though they chose different routes now, they would hear rustling in the trees and wonder if somewhere out there, a young bear was growing strong and healthy, alive because a little boy had known something was wrong, and wouldn't give up until he helped. The construction site was eventually completed, turned into a small office complex with neat landscaping and proper fencing. But Michael had made sure, through connections in his architectural firm, that the plans were modified to include wildlife corridors, safe passages for animals to move through without getting trapped. He never said why he was so insistent on this feature, but Lily knew. It was their way of honoring that morning, of ensuring that no other baby, bear or otherwise, would find itself trapped and alone with only the kindness of strangers for hope. Jacob, as he grew older, developed a deep love for animals and a gentle way with them that seemed almost magical to those who witnessed it. Dogs that barked at everyone else would calm at his approach. Cats that hid from strangers would curl up in his lap. And whenever they visited the zoo, he would stand longest at the bear exhibit, watching them with a concentration that reminded Lily of that morning at the pipe. Years later, when Jacob was old enough to understand, they told him the full story of that morning. He listened with wide eyes, especially to the part about the mother bear watching and waiting. "She trusted you," he said simply, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "She knew you would help." Lily and Michael exchanged glances over his head, marveling at how he had maintained that pure understanding that had led them to the cub in the first place. He asked to see the rabbit, now carefully preserved in a memory box, and held it gently. as if it still carried the echo of that frightened cub's need and his own instinctive response to help. The local newspaper had picked up the story, running it with the headline, "Toddler's Compassion Saves Bear Cub." But the article couldn't capture what had really happened that morning. It couldn't convey the way time had seemed to slow down as they coaxed the cub to freedom, or the weight of the mother bear's gaze, or the perfect innocence of Jacob's offering of his beloved toy. It couldn't explain how 3 humans and 2 bears had created a moment of perfect understanding, a bridge across species built from necessity and compassion. But the Hayes Morgan family knew, and they carried that knowledge like a secret treasure, a reminder that the world was full of unexpected connections waiting to be discovered. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, Lily would remember the sound of the cub's cries echoing from the pipe and Jacob's answering babble of comfort. She would think about how children seem to know things that adults have forgotten, that helping is simple, that kindness doesn't need words, that fear can be overcome with patience and love. Michael would occasionally drive by the old construction site, now bustling with office workers, and remember standing in the morning mist, flashlight in hand, willing a small frightened creature toward safety. And Jacob, though his memories of that day were more feeling than fact, would always stop when he heard an animal in distress, always look for ways to help, always remember that once, when he was very small, he had been a hero. The bear cub, wherever it was now, had grown into adulthood, carrying its own memory of that morning. Perhaps it remembered the darkness of the pipe, the fear of being trapped, the strange sounds of the humans who had appeared like angels in its darkest hour. Perhaps it remembered a small human cub who had offered his toy, who had sung nonsense songs, who had shown that kindness exists across all boundaries. Or perhaps it simply remembered warmth after cold, freedom after confinement, its mother's presence after terrible loneliness. Either way, somewhere in the forests beyond the city, a bear lived because a toddler had refused to ignore a cry for help. The morning walks continued, though always on different paths now. Jacob would ride in his stroller, then later walk beside his parents, always alert for animals in need, always ready with that same pure compassion that had saved a life. His stuffed rabbit, cleaned finely but never quite the same, went everywhere with him, a reminder of the morning when being small hadn't meant being helpless. Lily had sewn a little patch on it where the bear cub's teeth had left marks, a tiny badge of honor for a toy that had been part of something extraordinary. And sometimes, when Jacob hugged it tight, his parents could see the echo of that morning in his eyes, the understanding that we are all connected, that help can come from unexpected places, that even the smallest among us can be heroes. The story spread through their community, inspiring others to look more carefully at the world around them, to listen for cries for help that might otherwise go unheard. The local wildlife rescue organization saw an increase in volunteers, people moved by the story of a toddler who had known instinctively what to do. Children at Lily's kindergarten would ask to hear the story again and again, their eyes wide with wonder at the idea that someone just like them had saved a bear. And always, Lily would end the story the same way. Remember, you're never too small to help. Sometimes the smallest hands can do the biggest things. One autumn evening, almost a year after the rescue, the family was having dinner when Michael noticed movement in their backyard. He called Lily and Jacob to the window, and there, at the edge of their property where the yard met the woods, stood 2 bears. The larger one was clearly the mother from that morning. Something about her bearing, her careful watchfulness was unmistakable. Beside her was a younger bear, healthy and strong, confidently exploring the border between wild and civilized. They weren't threatening or searching for food. They were simply there, passing through, and had paused as if to check in. Jacob pressed his nose against the window and waved, his signature greeting. and the mother bear looked directly at them for a long moment before nudging her cub back toward the woods. "Do you think she remembers?" Jacob asked, his voice hushed with wonder. "I think she does," Lily replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "I think she wanted to show us that her baby is okay, that what we did mattered." They watched until the bears disappeared into the gathering dusk, then returned to their dinner with a sense of completion, of a circle closed. The universe had given them a gift that morning at the construction site. The chance to make a difference, to save a life, to connect across the vast divide between human and wild. And now it had given them confirmation that their actions had mattered, that the cub they had saved was thriving. As Jacob grew older, the story evolved from family memory to family legend to something even more, a touchstone for who they were as a family. When faced with difficult decisions, they would remember the morning when doing the right thing had meant staying with a frightened animal despite potential danger. When Jacob struggled with feeling too young or too small to make a difference in school projects or sports, his parents would remind him of the morning when his tiny voice had coaxed a bear cub to safety. And always, always, they remembered the lesson of the mother bear, that trust, when necessary, can overcome fear, that sometimes we must rely on the kindness of strangers, even strange strangers, to save what we love most. The construction site office complex eventually put up a small plaque near the spot where the pipes had been, commemorating the rescue. It was Michael's doing, though he never admitted it, working through his professional connections to ensure the story was preserved. The plaque simply read, "On this spot, compassion bridged the gap between human and wild. May we always remember to listen for those who need our help, no matter how small the voice." Visitors to the complex often paused to read it, puzzled by its meaning, but occasionally someone who knew the story would explain, and the tale would spread a little further, inspire a little more kindness. Jacob's teachers would later comment on his unusual empathy, his ability to notice when classmates were struggling, his instinct to help without being asked. They didn't know about the morning with the bear cub, about how his first act of heroism had shaped his understanding of his place in the world. But Lily and Michael knew, and they treasured the knowledge that their son's character had been forged in that moment of pure, instinctive compassion. He had learned before he could properly speak that helping others was not just something you did, but something you were called to do when the moment arose. The stuffed rabbit eventually fell apart, loved to pieces through years of adventures, but Lily saved the patch where the bear had left its mark. She had it framed with a photo from that morning, not of the rescue itself, they had been too focused to take pictures, but of Jacob afterward, muddy and tired and gloriously proud, holding his rabbit like a trophy. The frame sat on their mantel, a daily reminder of extraordinary things that can happen on ordinary mornings. Visitors would ask about it, and Jacob, as he grew more articulate, would tell the story himself, always emphasizing not his own role, but the bravery of the cub, the trust of the mother, the way everything had worked together to create a miracle. By the time Jacob was ready for high school, he had decided he wanted to be a wildlife veterinarian, a choice that surprised no one who knew his story. He volunteered at animal shelters, studied hard in his science classes, and always maintained that gentle approach with animals that had manifested that morning at the pipe. His college application essay wrote itself, the story of a toddler, a trapped cub, and a lesson about compassion that had shaped an entire life. But even in writing it, he struggled to capture the magic of that morning, the way the universe had seemed to pause and hold its breath as they worked to save one small life. Michael's architectural firm took on more projects with environmental considerations, influenced by his experience that morning. He became known for designs that considered wildlife corridors, that thought about the animals displaced by human construction. He never forgot the desperation in the mother bear's eyes, the way she had been forced to trust humans because human construction had trapped her baby. Every building he designed afterward carried a piece of that morning, a consideration for the wild lives that intersected with human ambition. His colleagues thought he was simply following trendy environmental consciousness, but Lily knew better. She knew he was honoring a promise made silently to a mother bear who had trusted them with her most precious thing. The family still took morning walks, though Jacob was often too busy with school and activities to join them. But on special occasions, anniversaries of the rescue, or particularly beautiful mornings, all three would return to walking together. They never went back to the exact spot. It felt too sacred, too changed by development. But they would walk in the same spirit of attention and openness that had led them to the cub. They would notice things others missed: birds building nests in unusual places, cats stuck in trees, dogs that had slipped their leashes and needed gentle coaxing home. And always they would help. Because that morning had taught them that this was simply what you did when you encountered need. 20 years passed, and Jacob, now Dr. Jacob Bennett, he had taken his middle name professionally, had his own veterinary practice specializing in wildlife rehabilitation. His office waiting room featured the framed photograph and patch from his rabbit, and he would tell the story to young clients who were scared of bringing their pets to the vet. "See," he would say, "even wild bears sometimes need help, and even little kids can be heroes." His own children, twins who had inherited their father's gentle nature, knew the story by heart and would act it out with their stuffed animals, always fighting over who got to be the brave baby who saved the bear. Lily and Michael, now grandparents, would watch these reenactments with tears in their eyes, remembering that misty morning when their own baby had shown them the power of pure compassion. The story had become larger than their family now, spreading through Jacob's practice, through the children he inspired, through the countless animals he saved with the same patient gentleness he had shown that trapped cub. Sometimes when they visited Jacob's practice and saw him working with a frightened animal, using that same soothing voice he had developed as a toddler, they could see the thread connecting that morning to this moment, a line of compassion stretching through time. On the 25th anniversary of the rescue, the local news did a follow-up story, interviewing the family about how that morning had changed their lives. Jacob, articulate and passionate about wildlife conservation, spoke about the responsibility humans have to help animals affected by human development. Michael discussed his architectural philosophy of building with nature rather than against it. But it was Lily who perhaps said it best. That morning taught us that heroes don't always wear capes or carry weapons. Sometimes they're barely 2 feet tall, carrying a stuffed rabbit, refusing to walk away from someone in need. The interview went viral, as these things do in the digital age, and suddenly people from around the world were sharing their own stories of unexpected animal rescues, of children who had known instinctively how to help, of moments when the barrier between human and wild had dissolved in the face of necessity. Jacob received letters from children who had been inspired to help animals, from adults who had changed careers to work in conservation, from people who simply wanted to say that the story had reminded them to pay attention, to listen for cries for help, to not walk past suffering even when helping seemed impossible. But perhaps the most remarkable response came from a wildlife photographer who had been working in the area for decades. She sent Jacob a series of photographs taken over the years of a female bear and her cubs, including one from about a year after the rescue that showed a young bear with distinctive markings that matched the description of the rescued cub. The photographer had been tracking this particular bear family for years, noting their unusual tolerance for human proximity, their tendency to den near but not too near human settlements. "I think this might be your bear," she wrote. "She's had 3 litters of her own now, all healthy, all thriving. Your rescue didn't just save one life, it saved generations." Jacob framed those photographs in his office, next to the original picture of himself with the rabbit. When particularly difficult cases came in, when he was faced with animals so traumatized or injured that saving them seemed impossible, he would look at those pictures and remember, sometimes all it takes is patience, gentleness, and the refusal to give up. He would remember his mother spreading a blanket to make the pipe exit less frightening. His father holding the flashlight steady for so long his arm had ached for days, and his own toddler self, offering the most precious thing he owned to a frightened creature he had never seen before, but somehow knew needed help. The office complex built on the old construction site eventually became a model for wildlife-friendly development, with architects from around the country coming to study its design. The wildlife corridors Michael had insisted on became highways for deer, foxes, and yes, occasionally bears, to move safely through the area. The plaque by the pipe location became something of a pilgrimage site for local families, who would bring their children to tell them the story and inspire them to be kind, to be brave, to help when help was needed. Some claimed that on misty mornings you could still hear echoes of a cub's cry and a toddler's comforting babble, though that was probably just imagination mixing with memory. But whether the echoes were real or imagined, the impact of that morning was undeniable. It rippled out through time and space, touching lives in ways the Hayes Morgan family could never have anticipated. A moment of compassion had become a legacy of kindness, a reminder that we are all connected, human and animal, young and old, powerful and vulnerable. The story of the baby who saved a bear became more than just a family tale. It became a parable about the power of refusing to walk away from suffering, about the courage it takes to help even when you're small, about the trust that can bloom between species when necessity demands it. And somewhere in the forests beyond the city, generations of bears lived and thrived, carrying in their genes the memory of survival, of human kindness, of a morning when the impossible became possible because a baby boy heard a cry for help and wouldn't stop until he answered it. They raised their cubs near, but not too near human settlements, teaching them through example that while humans should generally be avoided, sometimes, in the darkest moments when all seems lost, help can come from the most unexpected places. The bears didn't know the story, couldn't comprehend the chain of events their ancestors' rescue had set in motion, but they lived it nonetheless, proof that one act of kindness can echo through generations. Jacob, now middle-aged himself, still took morning walks when he could, though his path took him through different woods near his own home. His children, teenagers now, would sometimes join him, rolling their eyes when he stopped to investigate every unusual sound, but secretly proud of their father's reputation as the bear whisperer of the veterinary community. He had saved hundreds of animals over his career, but he always said the bear cub had saved him first, had shown him his purpose before he was old enough to understand what purpose meant. The cub had taught him that helping wasn't a choice, but a calling, that compassion wasn't a feeling but an action, that being small didn't mean being powerless. On particularly difficult days, when the weight of all the animals he couldn't save pressed heavy on his shoulders, Jacob would hold the old photograph of himself with the rabbit and remember the pure simplicity of that morning. No doubts, no second guessing, just the absolute certainty that something needed help and he could provide it. He tried to bring that same clarity to his work, cutting through the complexity of modern life to the simple truth at the heart of all healing, one being helping another, bridges built from compassion, trust offered and received. His colleagues said he had a gift, but Jacob knew better. He had been given a gift that morning, and he had simply spent his life trying to be worthy of it. The story continued to spread, adapted into children's books, referenced in wildlife conservation campaigns, used as a teaching tool in schools to discuss empathy and environmental responsibility. But for all its retellings, the heart of the story remained unchanged. A small voice calling for help, a smaller voice answering with comfort, and the miraculous moment when fear transformed into trust. It reminded people that heroes don't always know they're heroes, that the most profound acts of courage often come from the most innocent hearts, that the world is full of opportunities to make a difference if only we stop and listen. Lily, in her retirement, wrote a memoir about raising a child whose first act of heroism had occurred before he could form complete sentences. She wrote about the challenge of nurturing that compassion without overwhelming him with the weight of it, about teaching him that he couldn't save everyone, but that didn't mean he shouldn't try to save someone. She wrote about Michael's quiet transformation into an advocate for wildlife-conscious architecture, about her own journey from kindergarten teacher to wildlife education volunteer. But mostly, she wrote about that morning. The mist, the cries from the pipe, Jacob's insistent pointing, the mother bear's patient vigil, and the moment when a terrified cub had trusted enough to crawl toward the light. The book became required reading in many veterinary and conservation programs, not for its literary merit, but for its message about the interconnectedness of all life. Professors would discuss the ethical implications of human intervention in wildlife scenarios, the balance between helping and interfering, the responsibility that comes with the power to make a difference. But students would remember the image of a toddler offering his toy to a trapped bear, and understand that sometimes compassion transcends all ethical debates. Sometimes, you simply help because help is needed, and worry about the philosophy later. As Lily and Michael entered their 70s, they would often sit on their porch in the evening, watching the woods that bordered their property. They had chosen this house specifically for its proximity to wild spaces, for the possibility of glimpses into the parallel world that existed alongside their human one. Occasionally, they would see deer, foxes, even the odd bear passing through, and they would wonder if any of them were descendants of animals they had helped over the years. They had become known in their community as the couple to call when wildlife was in distress, the ones who would know what to do or who to contact. But they always dated their transformation back to that morning at the construction site, when their baby boy had taught them to see the world differently. Before that morning, they had been kind people, certainly, but afterward, they had been awakened to the constant presence of need around them, the countless opportunities to make a difference that most people walked past. Jacob had opened their eyes not just to one trapped cub, but to all the trapped and frightened creatures in the world, human and animal alike. He had shown them that helping wasn't somebody else's job. It was everyone's job, especially when you were the one who heard the cry for help. The construction company that had owned the site where the rescue occurred eventually commissioned a sculpture for their headquarters, a bronze depicting a small child reaching toward a bear cub, both frozen in a moment of tentative trust. The artist had captured something essential about that morning, the vulnerability of both creatures, the courage required from both sides, the bridge being built between two worlds. The sculpture became a symbol for the company's commitment to environmental responsibility, but for those who knew the story, it was more than corporate art. It was a monument to the moment when humanity and nature had found common ground in compassion. Jacob's children grew up and had children of their own, and the story passed to a fourth generation. These great-grandchildren of Lily and Michael would visit their famous ancestor, for Jacob had become something of a legend in wildlife rehabilitation circles, and begged to hear the story again. Jacob would tell it simply, without embellishment, always emphasizing that he had been too young to remember it clearly, that the real heroes were his parents who had stayed calm and found a way to help. But his children and grandchildren knew better. They had seen him work with animals, had witnessed the almost mystical connection he seemed to have with frightened creatures, and they knew it had all started that morning when he was barely old enough to walk. On what would have been the 50th anniversary of the rescue, Jacob received an unexpected package. Inside was a carefully preserved stuffed rabbit. Not his, that had long since disintegrated despite careful preservation, but one exactly like it, found in an estate sale, and purchased by someone who had heard the story. With it was a note. "I thought you should have this, to remember that the smallest gestures can change the world." Jacob held the rabbit, so similar to his old friend, and was transported back to that morning he could only remember in fragments and feelings. The weight of it in his small hands, the urgency of offering it to something that needed comfort, the joy when the cub had finally emerged into the light. He placed the rabbit in a place of honor in his home, where his grandchildren could see it and understand their family's legacy. Not a legacy of wealth or power, but of compassion, of attention to suffering, of the courage to help even when you're small and the problem seems big. He told them the story again, as he had so many times before, but this time he added something new. The bear cub grew up and had cubs of its own, he said, and they had cubs, and on and on. Somewhere out there are bears who exist because one morning we didn't walk away. Every life touches other lives. Every act of kindness creates ripples we can't even imagine. You may never know the full impact of helping someone, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't help. The local museum eventually created an exhibit about the rescue, featuring photographs, newspaper clippings, and recordings of the family telling their story. School groups would visit and learn about wildlife conservation, about the impact of human development on animal habitats, about the importance of compassion across species boundaries. But what struck visitors most was the ordinariness of the family in the photographs. Just regular people on a morning walk who had stumbled upon an opportunity to make a difference and had taken it. It made them wonder what opportunities they might be walking past, what cries for help they might not be hearing. As Lily and Michael passed away, within months of each other, as often happens with couples who have shared everything, their funeral services were filled with stories of animals helped, children inspired, lives changed by their example. Jacob spoke at both services, his voice steady despite his grief, about how his parents had taken a moment of childhood compassion and built it into a lifetime of purpose. How they had never let him forget that morning, not as a burden, but as a gift, a reminder of what humans could be at their best. How they had shown him that heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about presence, patience, and the willingness to stay with suffering until it transformed into healing. The bears, of course, knew nothing of human funerals or legacies, but in the forests beyond the city, they thrived. The descendants of that rescued cub raised their own young, teaching them the ancient ways of survival, the boundaries between wild and human spaces, the eternal dance of predator and prey. But perhaps, in some genetic memory or learned behavior passed down through generations, they carried a slightly different understanding of humans than their ancestors had. Not as enemies to be feared or food sources to be exploited, but as complicated creatures capable of both harm and help, to be avoided generally but not always, to be understood as part of the complex web of life they all shared. So 2 chapters of mentioned part has completed. Years had passed since that morning at the construction site, and life had settled into new rhythms for the Hayes Morgan family. Jacob was now 5, old enough to clearly remember recent events, though that morning, with the bear, remained more feeling than memory for him. It was a Thursday afternoon when Lily received a call that would set in motion another extraordinary encounter. Her friend Sarah, who worked at the local wildlife rehabilitation center, sounded unusually excited and mysterious. "Lily, you need to bring Jacob down here this afternoon if you can. There's someone you should see." Sarah wouldn't say more, only that it was important and that they should come as soon as possible. Michael was still at work, but Lily decided this was worth investigating. She picked up Jacob from kindergarten early, his teacher smiling knowingly as if she too had heard something through the community grapevine. Jacob was excited about the unexpected adventure, chattering about his day as they drove toward the rehabilitation center on the outskirts of town. The center was nestled against the same forest system where the bears had disappeared years ago, a modest collection of buildings and enclosures where injured and orphaned wildlife received care before being released back to the wild. Jacob had visited before on school field trips, but this felt different somehow, charged with an energy Lily couldn't quite identify. Sarah met them at the entrance, her face bright with anticipation. "Before we go in," she said, kneeling down to Jacob's level, "I need you to promise to be very quiet and calm, okay? We have a special patient who's a bit nervous around people." Jacob nodded solemnly, taking his mother's hand as Sarah led them not toward the main building but to a separate enclosure area used for larger animals. As they walked, Sarah explained that they had received an unusual patient 2 days ago, a young bear with an infected wound on its paw, brought in by hikers who had found it struggling near a trail. "The interesting thing," Sarah continued, glancing at Lily meaningfully, "is that this bear seems oddly comfortable around humans. Not aggressive, not entirely fearful, just watchful. And there's something else." They rounded the corner of the building, and there in a large, semi-natural enclosure was a bear. Not fully grown, but no longer a cub, probably 3 or 4 years old, with distinctive markings including a white patch on its chest that looked like a star. The bear was lying in the shade, its injured paw wrapped in white bandages, but when it heard them approach, it lifted its head and looked directly at them. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The bear's entire demeanor changed. It stood up, favoring its injured paw, and moved closer to the fence, making a soft huffing sound that wasn't aggressive but seemed almost like recognition. Jacob gasped softly, his hand tightening in Lily's. "Mama," he whispered, "the bear knows us." And incredibly, it seemed he was right. The bear's eyes were fixed on Jacob with an intensity that went beyond simple curiosity. It sat down near the fence, its head tilted in a gesture so familiar that Lily felt her breath catch. This was the same head tilt the mother bear had given them that morning, the same one the cub had displayed when Jacob sang his babbling song. "We think," Sarah said quietly, "based on the age and the markings, that this might be the cub you saved, the one from the pipe." The possibility hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and barely believable. Lily looked at the bear more carefully, trying to see the muddy, terrified cub in this young adult animal. The size was right, the timing was right, and that white star on its chest, had the cub had that? She couldn't remember, the morning had been so focused on just getting it free, but the bear's behavior, the way it watched Jacob with something that looked like recognition, that was harder to dismiss. "Can we?" Jacob started to ask, then stopped, unsure what he was even asking for. Sarah understood, though. "You can sit here for a while if you'd like. Sometimes, when we're treating animals that have had previous positive human contact, familiar presence can be calming." They settled on a bench positioned near the enclosure, and the bear settled too, lying down but keeping its eyes on them. Jacob began to talk, not to his mother or Sarah but to the bear, his voice soft and conversational. He told it about kindergarten, about his new teacher, about the picture he had drawn that morning of a family of rabbits. The bear's ears swiveled to follow his voice, and occasionally it would make soft sounds in response, not quite growls, more like acknowledgments. Lily found herself mesmerized by the interaction, by the possibility that this circle was somehow coming back around. Sarah had moved a discreet distance away, giving them space while keeping a professional eye on the situation. "Do you remember the pipe?" Jacob asked the bear suddenly, and Lily was surprised he remembered that detail since he usually told the story, focusing on other elements. The bear's ear twitched, which meant nothing, of course. Bears' ears twitched all the time. But Jacob took it as an answer. "It was dark and scary," he continued, "but you were brave. You came out even though you didn't know us." He stood up slowly, not approaching the fence but simply standing, and began to hum. It was the same tuneless, rambling melody he had hummed as a toddler, the one Lily still sometimes heard him humming when he was concentrating on building blocks or drawing. The bear's reaction was immediate. It stood up too, favoring its bandaged paw, and took a step closer to the fence. Sarah returned then, her expression one of professional amazement. "In 15 years of working with wildlife," she said quietly, "I've never seen anything quite like this. This bear should be terrified or aggressive, but it's like it's visiting old friends." She explained that the wound, while infected, would heal well with treatment. The bear would need to stay for about 2 weeks for antibiotics and observation, then would be released back to its territory. "Would you?" She hesitated, then continued. "Would you like to be here for the release? I think it might be good for the bear, a familiar presence during a stressful transition." The next 2 weeks became a routine of after-school visits. Michael joined them when he could, equally amazed by the bear's apparent recognition of their family. Each day, Jacob would sit by the enclosure and talk to the bear, sometimes doing his homework out loud, sometimes singing songs from school, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. The bear would always position itself as close to them as the enclosure allowed, often falling asleep to the sound of Jacob's voice. Other staff at the rehabilitation center began stopping by to witness these unusual interactions, taking notes for their research on human-wildlife bonds. On the 5th day, something extraordinary happened. Jacob had brought his old stuffed rabbit, not the original, which had long since fallen apart, but its replacement that his parents had bought him. He held it up to show the bear, and the animal's reaction was immediate and profound. It stood on its hind legs, something bears rarely did without provocation, and made a sound that everyone present agreed sounded almost like excitement. It pawed gently at the fence, not aggressively but as if trying to reach the toy. "It remembers," Jacob said with absolute certainty. "It remembers the rabbit." Whether it was true memory or just interest in a toy, nobody could say, but the moment felt weighted with significance. Sarah began incorporating the family's visits into the bear's treatment routine, noting that the animal was calmer and more cooperative with medical procedures when they were present. Its wound healed faster than expected, and its appetite, which had been poor initially, improved dramatically. "You're better than any medicine," she told Jacob, who beamed with pride. The staff began calling the bear Pipe informally, though they were careful not to name it officially since it would be returning to the wild. Still, the name stuck, and soon everyone at the center knew Pipe's story and would stop by to see the famous bear that had been saved as a cub. Local news caught wind of the story, the possible reunion between the rescued cub and its rescuers, but the family declined interviews, feeling that this chapter was too personal, too precious to share with the wider world. They allowed one photographer to document the interactions for the rehabilitation center's research, but otherwise, these 2 weeks existed in a protected bubble, a secret season of reconnection that felt almost sacred. Even Jacob, usually eager to share everything with his kindergarten class, kept these visits close, understanding somehow that this was different from show-and-tell material. As the release date approached, the atmosphere grew bittersweet. The bear was healthy, its paw fully healed, and keeping it longer would be cruel, no matter how remarkable the connection with the family. Sarah explained that the release would happen at dawn, in a location about 5 miles from where the bear had been found, an area known to be part of its territory. The family was invited to observe from a distance, to be part of this transition back to wildness. Michael took the day off work, and they arrived at the rehabilitation center while stars still dotted the sky, Jacob yawning but determined not to miss this moment. The bear was already in a transport cage, alert but calm. When it saw them, it made that soft huffing sound they had come to recognize as greeting. The drive to the release site was quiet, everyone understanding the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just releasing a healed animal, it was releasing a piece of their own history, a living connection to that morning at the construction site that had changed all their lives. The release site was beautiful, a meadow bordered by dense forest, with a stream running through it that caught the first light of dawn like scattered diamonds. Sarah and her team positioned the cage at the edge of the meadow, and the family stood about 30 feet away, far enough to be safe but close enough to be seen. Sometimes, Sarah explained, released animals run immediately into the forest. Sometimes they take their time, exploring, getting their bearings. Every release is different. She opened the cage door with a long rope pulley system, then everyone stepped back and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bear stayed in the cage, visible as a dark shape in the dawn light, seeming to consider its options. Then, slowly, it emerged. First, its head, testing the air, then its body, fully healed and powerful. It stood at the cage entrance, looking around the meadow, then turned to look directly at where the family stood. For a long moment, bear and humans regarded each other across the morning air, and Lily felt the same electric connection she had felt years ago with the mother bear. This was a moment of acknowledgement, of gratitude maybe, or perhaps simply of recognition. We know each other. We have shared something, and now we part. The bear took a few steps toward them, not threatening, just closing the distance slightly, then stopped. Jacob raised his hand in his characteristic wave, the same gesture he had given the mother bear years ago, the same one he had given Pipe every day at the rehabilitation center. The bear stood on its hind legs briefly, a behavior Sarah whispered was unusual and significant, as if returning the farewell. Then it dropped back to all fours, turned, and began walking toward the forest. Not running, not fearful, just walking with purpose toward its world. At the forest edge, it paused once more, looking back at them, and Jacob called out, "Bye, Pipe. Be safe." The bear disappeared into the trees, and the meadow was suddenly just a meadow again, beautiful but ordinary. They stood there for several minutes after the bear was gone, nobody quite ready to break the spell. Finally, Sarah spoke. "That bear will be fine, better than fine. It knows how to survive, and now it knows that not all humans are threats. That's valuable knowledge for a bear living near human populations." She was being professional, scientific, but Lily could see tears in her eyes. The drive back was quiet, Jacob falling asleep in his car seat, clutching his rabbit. Michael reached over and took Lily's hand, squeezing it gently. They didn't need words to share what they were feeling: pride, sadness, wonder, and a deep sense of completion. The story of Pipe's release spread through the rehabilitation center community, becoming a case study in the positive effects of early human intervention done correctly. Researchers would debate whether the bear truly remembered the family or had simply learned to associate certain humans with safety, but for the Hayes-Morgan family, the academic arguments were irrelevant. They knew what they had experienced, the connection that had spanned years and species, the circle that had closed in that meadow at dawn. Jacob would talk about Pipe occasionally, always with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested he found nothing unusual about having a bear friend. 3 months after the release, Sarah called with news. Trail cameras in the area had captured images of Pipe, healthy and thriving, foraging normally and showing appropriate wild bear behavior. In one image, it was seen near other bears, suggesting it had integrated successfully back into the wild population. But here's the interesting thing, Sarah added. The cameras show Pipe avoiding the hiking trails during busy times, but passing through during quiet early morning hours. It's like it's learned to coexist, to share the space without conflict. She sent them one particular image, taken at dawn, showing Pipe standing in profile against a misty forest background, that distinctive star marking clearly visible on its chest. Jacob printed that picture and put it on his bedroom wall, next to his drawings of bears and forests and pipes that he had made over the years. Sometimes Lily would find him looking at it before bed, not sad but thoughtful, as if conducting a silent conversation with his distant friend. When asked about it, he would simply say, "I'm telling Pipe about my day," as if this was the most natural thing in the world. And perhaps, Lily thought, for a child who had saved a bear before he could properly speak, maintaining a spiritual connection with that bear was perfectly natural. The Rehabilitation Center created an educational program based on Pipe's story, teaching children about wildlife conservation, the importance of proper rehabilitation, and the delicate balance between helping and interfering with wild animals. Jacob was invited to speak at the program's launch, and though he was nervous, he stood in front of a room full of adults and children and told the story simply and clearly. "The bear was scared," he said, "and we helped it not be scared anymore. Then, when it was hurt, it wasn't scared of us helping again. That's what happens when you're kind. Animals remember, and they trust you next time." The impact of his words, delivered with the straightforward honesty of a child, was profound. The audience was silent for a moment after he finished, then erupted in applause. But Jacob was already walking back to his seat, his part said, his message delivered. He had inherited his parents' understanding that heroism wasn't about recognition, but about action, that the reward for helping was simply knowing you had helped. The program went on to educate thousands of children over the years, each learning Pipe's story, each understanding that they too could make a difference if they paid attention and acted with compassion. As Jacob grew older, entering middle school and then high school, Pipe's story became less central to his daily life but never disappeared entirely. It was the foundation story of who he was, the origin point of his understanding of his place in the world. When he struggled with typical adolescent challenges, fitting in, finding his identity, dealing with academic pressure, he would sometimes think about that morning at the Pipe, about the clarity of purpose he had felt even as a toddler. It reminded him that the most important things in life were often the simplest. See suffering, offer help, don't give up. Wildlife biologists studying the bear population in the region began noticing interesting patterns. The bears in Pipe's territory showed less fear of humans, but also less aggression, maintaining distance but not fleeing at the first sign of human presence. they seem to have developed a more nuanced understanding of human behavior, avoiding conflict while successfully sharing the increasingly developed landscape. Some researchers theorize that pipe, with its unique history, had somehow communicated this balanced approach to other bears, though how this would happen remained a mystery. Others suggested it was simply parallel evolution, bears adapting to human presence out of necessity. But sometimes hikers would report unusual encounters. A bear watching them from a safe distance, not threatening but observant, sometimes with that distinctive white star on its chest. These bears would often have cubs with them, teaching the next generation through example how to navigate the human world. The hikers would pass peacefully, the bears would continue their foraging, and both species would go their separate ways, having shared a moment of mutual acknowledgement. These stories became part of local lore, the star bears that knew how to coexist, descendants perhaps of a scared cub pulled from a pipe years ago. Sarah, the rehabilitation center director, kept in touch with the family over the years, sending occasional updates when trail cameras captured images of Pipe. The bear was seen with cubs of its own. Pipe had turned out to be female, something they hadn't known during treatment. The cubs showed the same balanced behavior, the same ability to share space without conflict. One cub in particular, captured in a clear photograph, showed a faint star marking on its chest, and Sarah sent this image to Jacob with a note. The legacy continues. Jacob, now in college studying wildlife biology, kept that photo on his dorm room desk, a reminder of how one act of kindness could ripple through generations. During his senior year of college, Jacob received an unexpected call. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell Pipe's story, not just the rescue, but the entire arc, the reunion, the rehabilitation, the successful release, and the ongoing impact on bear-human relations in the region. They had already interviewed Sarah and other rehabilitation center staff, had footage from trail cameras, had even found the original news reports from the rescue. But they needed the family, particularly Jacob, to complete the story. After much discussion, the family agreed, feeling that enough time had passed and the message was important enough to share widely. The filming brought the family back to places they hadn't visited in years. The site of the old construction site, now a thriving office complex with its wildlife corridors intact. The rehabilitation center where Pipe had recovered. The meadow where they had said goodbye. Jacob, now 22 and articulate about conservation issues, spoke movingly about how that early experience had shaped his entire life trajectory. But the most powerful moment in the documentary came when he simply sat in the meadow, now a bearded young man instead of a small boy, and gave that same wave toward the forest, just in case Pipe was watching. The documentary, titled The Bear in the Pipe, A Story of Trust, premiered at a wildlife film festival and won several awards. But more importantly, it inspired a new generation of conservationists and rehabilitation specialists. Programs based on the principles learned from Pipe's case were implemented at rehabilitation centers across the country. The importance of considering an animal's history with humans, the value of familiar presence during treatment, the possibility of successful release even after significant human contact. The film ended with recent trail camera footage of a bear with a star on its chest, leading two cubs through a meadow at dawn, teaching them the old ways and the new ways of being a bear in a human world. Jacob went on to graduate school, specializing in human-wildlife conflict resolution, bringing to his research not just academic knowledge, but the deep, lived experience of connection across species boundaries. His doctoral thesis on adaptive coexistence, learning from individual animal experiences, referenced Pipe extensively. using the case as an example of how individual animal experiences could influence population-level behavior changes. The thesis was groundbreaking in its approach, suggesting that conservation efforts needed to consider not just species as a whole, but individual animals as teachers and bridges between worlds. At his thesis defense, one professor asked him how he could be sure that the bear at the rehabilitation center had really been the same cub from the pipe. Jacob thought for a moment, then answered, "I can't be sure in a scientific sense. But knowledge isn't always about proof. Sometimes it's about recognition, about connection, about the truth that lives in the space between what we can measure and what we know in our bones. That bear knew us, and we knew that bear. That's a different kind of truth than what we usually deal with in science, but it's truth nonetheless." The committee was silent for a moment. Then the questioning continued. But that answer would be remembered and quoted in discussions about the intersection of science and lived experience. Years passed, and Jacob became Dr. Bennett, a respected voice in wildlife conservation. He married a fellow conservationist he met at a conference, someone who understood his unusual connection to the ursine world. They had children of their own, twins who grew up hearing the story of Great Uncle Pipe, as they called the bear, and who showed the same instinctive kindness toward animals that their father had displayed. The family tradition of morning walks continued, now with a new generation keeping watch for animals in need, understanding that helping was not just something you did, but something you were called to be. On the 30th anniversary of the original rescue, the community held a celebration at the office complex built on the old construction site. The wildlife corridors had become a model for development nationwide, and the small plaque had been replaced with a larger monument including the story and images from over the years. Jacob spoke at the ceremony, his own children now the age he had been during Pipe's rehabilitation. He talked about legacy, about how one moment of compassion had rippled outward in ways they never could have imagined. He talked about Pipe's cubs and grand cubs, still occasionally spotted in the region, still showing that distinctive balanced behavior. But mostly, he talked about attention, the importance of paying attention to the world around us, of listening for cries for help, of being ready to act when action is needed. "I was too young to know I was being brave," he said. "I just knew something needed help. We've made the world so complicated, but helping doesn't have to be complicated. Listen. Act. Don't give up. That's all it takes to change a life, maybe many lives, maybe even the relationship between species." The audience, including his elderly parents, now in their 80s but still sharp and proud, applauded not just his words but the life he had built on the foundation of that morning's compassion. Trail cameras in the region continued to capture images of bears with star markings, and hikers continued to report peaceful encounters with bears that seemed unusually tolerant of human presence. Whether these were all Pipe's descendants, or whether the behavior had spread through the population through some unknown mechanism, remained a subject of study and debate. But for the people living in the region, the star bears had become a symbol of hope. Proof that humans and wildlife could coexist, that the boundaries between worlds could be crossed with respect and care. Jacob's children grew up and had children of their own, and still the story continued, passed down, but also lived out in daily choices to pay attention, to help, to not walk past suffering. The original stuffed rabbit, or rather its carefully preserved remains, eventually went to a natural history museum as part of an exhibit on human-wildlife interactions. But replicas were made, and every child in the extended family had one, a reminder of their heritage of helping. These rabbits accompanied them on walks, on adventures, always ready to be offered to something scared and in need of comfort. One morning, 50 years after the original rescue, one of Jacob's grandchildren, a little girl named Lily, after her great-great-grandmother, was walking with her parents when she heard something. A sound from a drainage ditch, small and frightened. She insisted they investigate, and there they found a fox kit, separated from its family and unable to climb out. As her parents called wildlife rescue, Lily sat by the ditch and sang to the kit, offering her own stuffed rabbit as comfort. The kit was successfully reunited with its family, and another link was added to the chain of compassion that had started with a bear in a pipe. The Rehabilitation Center, now named the Pipe Wildlife Recovery Center in honor of its most famous patient, had grown into a major facility, treating hundreds of animals each year. Sarah had long since retired, but new generations of rehabilitators carried on the work, always telling new volunteers the story of the bear that had remembered its rescuers, the family that had stayed connected across species boundaries. It had become more than just a story. It was a philosophy of care that recognized animals as individuals with memories, experiences, and the capacity for trust. Research papers were published about the pipe effect, the observed phenomenon of reduced human-wildlife conflict in areas where individual animals had experienced positive human intervention. While the mechanism remained debated, the results were clear. In regions where rehabilitation and release were handled with attention to individual animal experience, subsequent generations showed better adaptation to human presence. It suggested that conservation wasn't just about preserving habitat or managing populations, but about individual encounters that could reshape entire ecosystems of interaction. Jacob, now in his 70s, still walked in the mornings, though more slowly than before. Sometimes he would stop at the edge of the forest and give his characteristic wave, not knowing if any bear was watching, but maintaining the ritual that had connected him to the wild world for his entire life. Once, just once, he swore he saw a shape in the trees, a bear with a star on its chest, watching him with that familiar tilted head. It was probably imagination, the wishful thinking of an old man, but he waved anyway, and the shape, if it had been there at all, melted back into the forest. The world had changed dramatically over the decades. Climate change, development, technology reshaping everything. But in one small region, bears and humans had found a way to coexist, to share space with mutual respect. All because one morning, a toddler had refused to ignore a cry for help. It wasn't a solution to all the world's environmental problems, but it was proof that solutions were possible, that the boundaries between human and wild weren't walls, but membranes, permeable with compassion and attention. As Jacob entered his final years, he wrote a book about his experience, not a scientific text, but a meditation on connection, on the responsibility that comes with consciousness, on the possibility of communication beyond language. He wrote about the bear in the pipe, about pipe in the rehabilitation center, about all the star bears that had followed, but mostly he wrote about attention, the importance of staying alert to the world's needs, of being ready to help even when you feel too small, of understanding that every action creates ripples that extend beyond our ability to track them. The book ended with a simple message. We are all connected. Every human, every animal, every living thing. When we help one, we help all. When we save one, we save ourselves. The bear in the pipe taught me this before I had words to understand it, and I've spent my whole life trying to live up to that first lesson in compassion. May you find your own pipe, your own trapped soul to free, your own moment to discover that helping isn't just something we do, but something we are. When Jacob passed away peacefully at age 81, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, fellow conservationists, former students, people who had been inspired by his story to pursue careers in wildlife rehabilitation. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from the trail cameras in the forest that week, which captured an unusual gathering of bears near the old release meadow, including several with star markings on their chests. They stayed for hours, foraging peacefully, before dispersing back into the forest. The scientists called it coincidence, but Jacob's family knew better. They knew it was goodbye, a final acknowledgement from the wild world to one who had been their friend. The story didn't end with Jacob's death. His children and grandchildren carried it forward, each in their own way. Some became scientists, some teachers, some artists who painted the intersection of human and wild. But all of them carried that fundamental understanding that compassion was not limited by species, that help could come from anywhere and should be offered everywhere. The Pipe Wildlife Recovery Center established the Jacob Bennett Memorial Fund, ensuring that animals would continue to receive care regardless of their species' economic or conservation value. Because every life mattered, every creature deserved a chance. And in the forests, the star bears thrived. Generations of them now. Some with prominent stars, some with just hints of white on their chests, all carrying in their genes or their learned behavior the memory of trust offered and received. Hikers would occasionally report seeing them, always at a respectful distance, always with that sense of mutual acknowledgement. The bears had learned that humans could be dangerous but also helpful, that the strange two-legged creatures were complex and worth understanding rather than simply fearing or attacking. 100 years after the original rescue, long after all the original participants had passed away, a child on a school field trip to the Pipe Wildlife Recovery Center would hear the story and ask, "Did it really happen? Did a baby really save a bear?" The guide would smile and point to the carefully preserved artifacts, photographs, the plaque from the construction site, a replica of the famous rabbit. "It really happened," she would say, "and it's still happening." Every time someone helps an animal, every time we choose compassion over fear, every time we remember that we share this world with other lives that matter, it happens again.